On February 13, 1942, Theodore Seuss Geisel, also known as Dr. Seuss, published a political cartoon titled Waiting for the Signal from Home. The cartoon depicted a mass of caricatures and stereotypical Japanese Americans marching throughout the West Coast picking up blocks of TNT. This was to imply that Japanese Americans were planning to sabotage the United States. His portrayal of Japanese Americans was used to dehumanize them, as well as fueling Americans with paranoia. This cartoon was released just a couple of days before Roosevelt's executive order, which reflected the deep-seated anti-Japanese sentiment and influenced doubts regarding the Japanese American loyalty. Wartime propaganda like this contributed to the fear, discrimination, and internment camps directed towards Japanese Americans. The image of people being marched off the camp is often remnant of people in Nazi Germany. However, one only needs to look at the photos of Japanese Americans marching to internment camps during World War II. What may seem shocking is not. There was a fueled hatred towards Japanese Americans.
The constitutional rights of Japanese Americans were violated in 1942 when they were removed from their homes and relocated to internment camps under FDR's Executive Order 9066.
During World War II, tensions throughout the world were rising. After the attacks on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, there was a widespread fear and suspicion that Japanese Americans were conspirators or spies plotting against the United States of America. This renowned fear led to the United States government under Executive Order 9066, signed by President Franklin D. Roosevelt on February 19, 1942, to legally allow military personnel to forcibly remove any Japanese persons from the West Coast. This included the Japanese first-generation immigrants, called Issei, and second-generation, called Nisei. Over 120,000 Japanese individuals were forced to move out of their homes and transported to various internment camps around the United States. There were numerous facilities and camps established around the United States to house Japanese Americans during World War II, primarily in western states. The largest internment camp was in Tule Lake, California. It housed over 18,500 people and was active between May 25, 1942 and March 20, 1946. Other major internment camps included Manzanar, Topaz, Heart Mountain, Minidoka, Granada, Gila River, Boston, Rower, and Jerome. In addition to these camps, multiple army facilities also helped people with Japanese ancestry during World War II, with 4 facilities in Hawaii and 1 in Alaska. For internment camps in Hawaii, incarceration rates were significantly lower. However, Japanese Americans comprised over 1/3 of the population, and their labor force was crucial to sustaining the economy.
These internment camps were deliberately picked and located in remote federally owned areas to isolate inmates from the general population. They were not planned or built prior to the war and were built quickly within a matter of weeks once Executive Order 9066 was signed. The Relocation Authority oversaw camps while the Wartime Civil Control Administration quickly established the temporary reception centers. Meanwhile, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers was tasked and responsible for construction. In order to get the build done quickly, existing 1938 designs for Army barracks were used as a basis for inmate housing. Early arrivals, including the volunteers, endured harsh and unfinished conditions of the camps along with resource limitations. These camps did not just impact Japanese Americans, they also impacted other Asian ethnic groups who were misidentified as Japanese individuals. After Executive Order 9066 was established, the Secretary of War and military commanders began evacuating all persons of the West Coast deemed as a threat. In total, over 120,000 Japanese Americans were relocated, with 2/3 of them being forcefully relocated. A few days after Order 9066 was passed, Congress enacted Public Law 503 on March 21st, making violations of Order 9066 a misdemeanor punishable by up to 1 year in prison and a $5,000 fine. On March 29, 1942, former U.S. Senator Lieutenant General John L. DeWitt, commander of the Western Defense Command, issued Public Proclamation No. 4, which officially initiated the forced evacuation and detention of Japanese American residents on the West Coast. Even before this proclamation, DeWitt had pushed for the mass removal of Japanese Americans. After the Pearl Harbor bombing, his team implemented martial law in Hawaii, enforcing curfews and strict regulations on residents.
Families were given 48 hours to leave their homes and take their belongings with them. They were then sent to temporary assembly centers, which were unsanitary and cramped. They were later sent to relocation centers, known as internment camps. None of these Japanese Americans were disloyal to their country, and none of them were given any form to appeal their loss of liberty, freedom, and property. The camps were unsanitary, surrounded by barbed wire fences, and had guards who were ordered to take down and shoot anyone who attempted to leave the camps. However, despite the difficulty and conditions of the camps, there were multiple attempts at rehumanization made by the incarcerated Japanese Americans. They established newspapers, markets, schools, sports teams, and departments. Since they were all isolated from outside society, they humanized themselves by attempting to create their own society.
Even the medical care in the camps was primarily provided by Japanese American healthcare workers, doctors, and physicians, despite the lack of resources and medical supplies. Schools in these camps also contributed to government Americanization efforts aiming to turn Japanese Americans into loyal citizens, where they were forced to assimilate into white culture and grow disconnected from their cultural roots. During a time when there was widespread uncertainty about Japanese loyalty, the U.S. government administered a loyalty questionnaire to Nikkei citizens and immigrants in the World War II concentration camps. The government defended its treatment of around 120,000 incarcerated people because of their response to two major questions. Question 27 and 28 essentially asked if they would defend and swear unqualified allegiance to the United States and renounce any allegiance to the Japanese emperor. However, these questions sparked confusion, especially considering the circumstances of those answering the question who were born in the U.S. and had never gone to Japan. Those who answered incorrectly were sent to Tule Lake, which was rebranded and called a segregation center.
Despite the confusion, Japanese Americans demonstrated their loyalty by their actions. President Roosevelt activated the 442nd Regimental Combat Team on February 1, 1943. The regiment was comprised of Hawaiian-born Nisei, second-generation Japanese Americans, which made up about two-thirds of the regiment, with the remaining third being Nisei from the mainland United States. This regiment essentially put Japanese Americans on the front line. Their motto was "Go for broke," essentially meaning to put everything on the line to win it for the betterment of the United States. So while the Japanese Americans were being questioned for their loyalty, they demonstrated their loyalty by fighting for their country on the front lines, willing to put their lives on the lines for the United States of America. Mitsui Endo, a first-generation Japanese-American citizen, was the pioneer in the landmark lawsuit that led to the closure of Japanese internment camps and the freedom of Japanese Americans. She was a clerical worker, and like many people, after the Japanese attacked on Pearl Harbor, she was dismissed by the California State Personnel Board. With the support of the Japanese American Citizens League, JACO, Endo challenged her dismissal. With the help of James C. Purcell, who filed the petition to the San Francisco Federal District Court, it ended with the Supreme Court ruling that helped close Japanese internment camps in the United States. Once the final camps closed in 1946, Japanese Americans tried to reintegrate into society where they were subjected to hostility and discrimination. Many returned home to find that they could no longer reclaim their house, property, and businesses, with many of them being stolen and vandalized. The federal government addressed this by opening temporary hostels and trailer installations for those without a place to live. Many realized they had little to return to on the West Coast and saw opportunities in places such as the Midwest and East Coast. Regardless to where they were now relocating, there was immense pressure from the War Relocation Authority for Japanese Americans to only speak English and assimilate with American culture. Overall, camp residents lost over $400 million in property during the incarceration and were only compensated for $38 million in reparations in 1948. Years later, in 1988, Public Law 100383, the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, was passed by Congress and signed by former President Reagan. It acknowledged the injustice of internment camps, apologized for them, and provided a $20,000 cash payment to each person who was incarcerated.
Despite reparation attempts, Japanese Americans faced widespread societal rejection after their release, making finding jobs and purchasing houses difficult. As a result, many were restricted to working in domestic services. This exclusion led to the reformation of ethnic enclaves.
Although the camps closed over 70 years ago, their legacy continues to stay in the Japanese community in America. Since the start of COVID-19 pandemic, there has been an uptick in hate crimes directed towards Asian Americans. Despite the virus originating in China, many Japanese Americans face retaliation and were physically attacked. In an effort to bring awareness to the situation, public leaders led anti-Asian hate protests and voiced their support through speeches about the resilience and contribution that Japanese Americans have made in society.
The effects from these internment camps are seen today in pop culture through books, movies, shows, music, and performances. One notable example is the Broadway musical Allegiance, which debuted on November 8, 2015. This musical was inspired by the life experiences of its star, George Takei, who was imprisoned in the Tule Lake camp. It explores his journeys of resilience and loyalty despite the injustice he faced. The play was last performed on February 14, 2016. However, it was filmed and is still seen by many today.
The internment of Japanese Americans during World War II marks a dark chapter in American history, which drastically altered the lives of many American citizens. Justified under the guise of national security, American officials violated constitutional rights of Japanese American citizens by forcibly removing them and interning them. As a result, friends, families, and businesses within the Japanese American communities were destroyed. The injustice faced by Japanese Americans uncovers the dangers when the government fails to protect individual freedoms of its citizens.
And our only crime was we had Japanese blood. We were not traitors. We were not, insurrectionists. We did nothing. Our crime was our face.